So what we're going to talk about is the siege, but primarily the attempted relief operations in Mesopotamia for the siege of Kut. And that's between December 1915 and the end of April 1916. Just to give you a bit of background about what British and Indian forces were actually doing in Mesopotamia in the first place. Well, unsurprisingly, in that part of the world, the main reason we were there was to secure a supply of oil for the Royal Navy. Not long before the First World War, Churchill, as when he was at the Admiralty, sort of brought the Royal Navy modern warships into being oil-fired rather than coal-fired, and we needed a good oil supply. And the Anglo-Persian oil works at Abadan needed to be protected, so we needed to secure an area around Abadan if the Turks came into the war potentially against British interests. The campaign was primarily an Indian-led campaign, initially in terms of actual command and control, and throughout the campaign in controls of manpower and supplies and logistics, etc. Mainly because the geographical location of Mesopotamia is a lot closer to India than it is to the UK, and also, of course, because British commitment to the Western Front, and then as the war went on, places like Palestine, Salonika, Italy, etc. So it was easier to supply it via India. Now, initially, the expeditionary force, Indian Expeditionary Force D, which is sent to Mesopotamia in 1914, comprises one division, the 6th Puna Division. But by the end of the relief operations in April 16, there are 4 additional divisions in Mesopotamia. Only one of those is a fully British division. That's 13th Division, which comes out from Egypt. It had been used in Gallipoli and had gone back to Egypt to rebuild before being sent to Mesopotamia. The thing about an Indian infantry division is that each brigade was made up of 3 Indian infantry units and 1 British regular battalion. The reason for having a British regular battalion, now it goes back to 1857, the Indian Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion, give it its more modern name. That is because we don't fully trust the Indian Army. So the idea is you put a British regular battalion in there, the brigade, strengthens the Indian troops and also make sure that they don't do anything dubious on the battlefield. The other thing is, of course, the Indian Army at this time doesn't have any artillery apart from light mountain guns, and that again is the legacy of 1857, where we don't want the Indian Army to have artillery, as they might turn the guns the wrong way. So that's one thing that we haven't done in the mid 19th century. So IEFD leaves Bombay 16th of October, and at the end of the month is that's 1914. Is anchored off Bahrain, commanded by this chap, Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Barrett. 5th of November, we're at war with Turkey, and the force lands at Fao. And on the 21st of November, Basra is occupied by this force. And the campaign really should have ended in April 1915 with the British Indian victory at the Battle of Shaibar. And this basically puts the Turks on the back foot in southern Mesopotamia, secures the oil field, we push the Turks far enough north, and really that is the end of the campaign. All we've gone there to do was to secure that oil supply. As long as you've got a good defensive perimeter far enough north, the Turks aren't the threat. We've lost under 2,000 men by that time, so it's a pretty cheap victory. However, it's been quite an easy victory, and there is now what we would now call mission creep starts to come in. And Chief Political Officer Sir Percy Cox, who's been sent there by the Indian government, starts to report back to the Viceroy that very easy victories against these local Turkish forces. Most of them are Arab conscripts who don't really want to fight for the Ottomans. Why don't we push on? Baghdad fabled city of Baghdad, only 400 miles away. Surely not much in our way. We can reach Baghdad. And then India has a new province to govern. Won't that be great for the Viceroy and Percy Cox's career as well? Barrett argues that to actually advance on Baghdad, he needs more troops. He wants another couple of divisions. But the trouble is, this isn't what the Indian government want to hear. The Indian government wants to do everything on the cheap. And this was one of the damning indictments of the 1917 Mesopotamia Commission. And India is not really prepared to put the resources in to do things properly. It wants cheap victory, so it doesn't want to hear from its commander in Mesopotamia, but it needs more men. So they send out this officer, Sir John Nixon, and with him comes 12th Indian Division. And because there's now 2 divisions there, they form a corps, and Nixon is made overall commander. Barrett then falls ill, and they use this as an excuse to get rid of Barrett because he obviously wants more and more troops. Nixon agrees with Cox, says, yes, it's going to be pretty easy. We'll go off, take Baghdad. The Turks aren't up to much. We'll just go for it. What then happens is that the Viceroy starts petitioning the India office in London, which is under this time Austin Chamberlain. And Chamberlain basically just believes anything that India tells him and starts pushing the British government and says to them, look, you know, there's a chance of victory here. Seizure of Baghdad, it would be great morale-wise and prestige-wise. And the War Office and the War Cabinet grudgingly, they've got some misgivings, but they agree with this idea. So the campaign is on. In April 1915, another officer arrives to command 6th Pune Division, and that is, of course, General Sir Charles Townshend, synonymous with this early part of the campaign. He does have reservations about the idea of advancing up the Tigris with only 1 division, and this is what he says. He said, although the advance was against my better judgment, and only boldness of manoeuvre and shock action could possibly give success in such an enterprise, I felt that if it could be done, possibly I could do it, for I had absolute confidence in my command. He also has absolute confidence in himself. He actually thinks he's one of the best officers in the British Empire, knows his military history inside out, was a great fan of Napoleon, and he feels this is a great chance to win glory for himself, get promotions. This is what he does all the way through his career. He's always looking at least the next 2 jobs ahead and petitioning anybody that can potentially help him get there. He's not very well liked amongst many of the other officers. So he's a bit of a pusher for himself. So although he's basically said, oh, I think it's a bit dubious to do this, when he's been told to do it, that's it, he's going to go off and try to actually do this. So in May 1916, they move on and take Amara, mainly by bluff, and then Nixon orders the advance to Kut-al-Amara and then on to Baghdad. Now, Tanzan on his way up the river fights 2 big battles, first in mid-September at Essin, just below Kut, where he defeats the Turks, and he then pushes on to Pest Supply, where on the 22nd of November 1915, he engages the Turkish army only about 25 miles south of Baghdad. And here, in a 2-day battle, he's actually stopped. He's fought to a standstill, and he loses, by this time, he's lost about 50% of his manpower. It's impossible for him to move on and take Baghdad. So he falls back, and he falls back to Kut. When he arrives at Kut on the 3rd of December 1915, he's got about 12,000 men, plus Indian non-combatants, and he now looks at the idea about should he stand at Kut or should he retreat back down the Tigris towards Amara and join up with British and Indian troops which are still in theatre. Now, in his memoirs in 1920, he writes the following. He says, "The resolution I took to stand at Kut saved us from being simply kicked out of Mesopotamia. All Mesopotamia would have risen behind us had I continued my retreat past that point. To stand at Kut was the only way to enable the government to bring reinforcements from overseas and prepare for disaster. Now, one could argue that the disaster was basically partly of his own making, and had they not advanced towards Baghdad, they wouldn't have been in this situation anyway, and wouldn't have had to actually put more troops into the theatre who could have been better used elsewhere. Nixon is also very much for Townshend holding at Kut, and he tells him that he will be relieved within a month. We'll put a relief force together, and within a month, the troops will arrive. Townshend agrees to this. Nixon then contacts him again and says, well, actually, it might take up to 2 months for us to come and rescue you. Townshend then has the idea that he should try to should actually withdraw from Kut, break out and move to the south. But Nixon says, no, you must hold the position. That's where you've got to halt. During December, up until really the end of December, the Turks tried to take Kut by storm. And the largest attack comes on Christmas Eve, on a quick account by Captain Keith Freeland, who was in the Indian Volunteer Regiment, of an attack on the fort. If you've got that map of the Kut defences, you'll see the fort in the northeast perimeter. And this is his account. He said, as we reached the barricades, each man found his place beside the Oxfords and opened up a rapid fire at the sea of yellow jackets and long bayonets on long walls. After using up my own, Wheeler's and Captain Dawling's revolver ammunition, and Oxford's brains were blown out alongside me. So I was able to get to work with his rifle. My bag was about 7, was about 7 by then, and the Turks then got away. An increased pile of dead at the edge of the ditch made an obstacle over which they had to break. We got a good target at about 20 yards, which couldn't be missed. This finished the show. Not a shot could be heard anywhere in the deadly calm that ensued. The whole place was a mass of smoke, ammunition boxes, unexploded bombs, dead and wounded, broken rifles, bits of bodies and chunks of brain. So that's pleasant Christmas Eve in Kut. Now, after the Turks failed to take it by storm, they decided to go for a classic siege. And from this point, it's really sniping, because the Turks, as you can see, Kut's in a river bend, and the Turks basically surround it on 3 sides. So the Turks are shelling into the town and into the defences and sniping from basically 3 sides. So Kut is almost like a salient. And 6 divisions settles down to a pretty standard routine, fighting occasionally, but mainly just holding the line. And this was Lieutenant Henry Rich of the 120th Rajputana Rifles. And this is what his routine was during the siege. He said, we spent the mornings after breakfast doing rounds of the trenches and talking to the men, sniping the Turk. We often had a sleep in the afternoon, as the nights were often not quiet. Then in the evening, we had a meal and played bridge. So that's pretty typical for a British officer in an Indian Army regiment in Kut. Now, there were 2 major factors that undermined Townshend's ability to really conduct a successful siege. These are 2 factors from within the actual besieged garrison. And firstly was Townshend's leadership. Now, to the ordinary British soldier, Townshend remained a very respected figure. And during the early part of the siege, Gunner J.D. Lee recorded the following. He said, in the evenings, accompanied by a colonel of the staff and 2 Indian orderlies, Townshend would visit certain points of the defence and always had a cheery word for those he met. In his well-fitting uniform and field service cap at the BT angle, he looked the ideal general that he was, and the whole force was proud to be under his command. Now, not everybody shared this view of Townshend, and some of the people that didn't were his immediate subordinates. General Charles Mellis wrote a series of letters to his wife while he was in the siege, and this is one he wrote on Christmas Day, and he said, Townshend is a hopeless, incapable dreamer, an arse, vain as a peacock and full of military history comparisons. But as a practical soldier, one's grandmother would be as good. Sometimes one doesn't know whether to laugh or cry at his incapacity. He never goes near the frontline trenches and sees things for himself. And if you read Townshend's communications with Tigris Corps and his post-war memoirs, it is absolutely, as Mellis states, military history comparisons, everywhere compared with Napoleon, etc., and he compares himself quite favourably with some of these great commanders from the past as well. The idea of the principle of force, this is what he keeps coming back to all the time throughout his memoirs, telling Aylmer and Gorange how they should be conducting operations to relieve him. Now, the thing is, Townshend's defence is by no means vigorous, it's quite passive, even though on a number of occasions he actually puts forward the idea of breaking out from Kut and assisting the relief force as it moves north. So, in other words, to attack the Turks from behind, whilst Tigris Corps is actually moving up to engage them from the front. However, every chance that is feasible, including in March at the jailer Redoubt, when Tigris Corps is only 8 miles from Kut, he never takes them. He always finds a reason not to do it. He was sort of right. It was very, very difficult. It would have been a very difficult and dangerous thing. He would have had to get his men across the pontoon bridge at night without being spotted by the Turks on the far bank. As I say, the Turks were surrounding him on 3 sides. He would only able to get about 3,000 men across the bridge during the night, and it would have been an absolute disaster had the Turks spotted his men crossing the bridge. And had they not secured a victory, the Turks could have come in and crushed what was left of the Kut garrison, leaving Townshend's men to just simply be captured or destroyed. So in a way, you could argue that he had a case for not doing this. And obviously, as the siege lengthened and the men are eating less and less in the way of rations, the men are weaker and less able to actually do any of this sort of support operation. And that's what comes up next. It's this idea about supplies. And initially, Townshend keeps his garrison on full rations, as he's expecting to relieve in a matter of weeks. But when this doesn't happen, there are quite dire consequences for the rest of the siege. Lieutenant Rich, who we've heard from before, said the following about the whole length of the siege, and he breaks it down into 3 periods of time. He said, "We had 7 weeks of plenty, followed by 10 weeks of adequacy, gradually getting less and less. Finally, we had 4 weeks of starvation, which was complete hell." The one good thing Townshend does is to send the cavalry away from Kut as soon as he gets there, because they're going to be useless. You can't use cavalry in a siege. All you're going to be able to do is eat their horses. So they go, but he doesn't send the Indian regimental followers, who again, useless mouths to feed in a siege. And also he doesn't expel the local population. There's about 9,000 Arabs living in Kut. He wants to send them out, but Percy Cox, that the women and children will starve to death, the Turks won't look after them, and this will massively damage British prestige in Mesopotamia. So Townshend reluctantly agrees to keep most of the population in the town, which means he has to feed them during the siege. The other problem he has, of course, is that he is very much, he very soon has a very much of a downer on his Indian troops, which is unfortunate as they make up the vast majority of his garrison. He says that there are lots of lack of discipline, conflicting wounds, desertion, etc. within Indian ranks, apart from the Gurkhas. And in one telegram to Elba, he says, "As regards the morale of a good part of your Indian troops, I have the same problem here, but more modified. It is my handful of Norfolks, Dorsets, and Oxfords who are my sheet anchor here. What we do not want is inferior drafts of Indian recruits from India, such as my battalions were filled with after the Battle of Kut-al-Amara in September. One or two good all-British divisions are what we want. Now is the time to demand good white troops from overseas, an army corps to save and hold Mesopotamia if the government considers it worth holding. His whole memoir is littered with basically comments downgrading his Indian troops, almost blaming them for the loss of Kut. Although there were some problems, there were heavy casualties amongst British and Indian officers at Essin and Ctesiphon before the siege, which left them short of good officers. Lieutenant Rich says he had no problem keeping good morale with his unit. He said there was no problem maintaining discipline in our unit during the siege. As we were living right on top of the men, you could only walk a few yards without bumping into them. It was very easy for them to keep close eye on what the men were doing, chat to them, reassure them, etc., etc. So I think Townshend is really shifting blame elsewhere. If we look towards the end of the siege, they did try to use air supply. This is the first time that air supply was actually used, but as you can see, BE2s, etc., they're not actually capable of carrying much in the way of supplies. Colonel Jack Calloway remembered of these airdrops. He said it was quite a joke. The poor chaps would fly over and drop supplies. One thing they were asked to drop was money, rupees, as you could spend it in the bazaars. Sometimes they miscalculated and dropped the supplies in the wrong place, but many chaps ended up with rupees as curios as they were bent in the airdrop. They also dropped medical supplies. Everything was too close, and once the drop was located, you had to wait till night time to go and get it. But it was really not successful. It made no real contribution, except from the point of view of medical. So they just can't do it. They've got very few aircraft. They've only got 4 or 5 pilots fit to fly. Most of these guys are down with dysentery, etc. Weather is generally unfavourable, and it just doesn't work. The final thing they tried to do is run the blockade of Kut with a steamer, the Julnar, packed months supplies with a volunteer crew, but it gets fouled on some cables the Turks have put across the river, shelled and captured. So in the end, it's really impossible to keep the siege going. So whilst trying to come to terms with the siege, keep morale up, keep supplies going, a relief force is formed downriver about 30 miles away, which will be called Tigris Corps, and it's commanded by Lieutenant General Fenton Aylmer. Now, interestingly, in 1895, Aylmer is in the relief column for the siege of Chitral in the north of India, and the garrison commander of Chitral is Townshend. So this is the second time that Aylmer is coming to basically get Townshend out of the siege situation. Now, what we have to bear in mind is we know that Townshend says he's only got a finite amount of supplies. So throughout these relief operations, Aylmer and later Gorange, who replaces him, there is this time constraint that they're under. They have to relieve Kut before the supplies run out. And this causes a great problem, because what tends to happen is the troops arrive in Mesopotamia in dribs and drabs. So individual units arrive, are rushed to the front. What will then happen is, well, what did happen 3 times, is that Aylmer is forced into an attack on the Turkish positions because he thinks Townshend's going to run out of supplies. Then what would happen is Townshend would suddenly come back with a telegram saying, oh, we've recalculated our supplies and we've got another 20 days, which gives Aylmer more time. Aylmer will then build his forces up and then thinks, oh, I'm going to run out of time again. Townshend needs to be relieved. Try another assault. Again, failure, another 2,000–3,000 casualties. And then Townshend will come back and say, oh, I've just done another recalculation of supplies and we can now last until April. And this happens 3 times, and it means that there are a number of assaults that go in before the Tigris Corps is really at full strength. There are men still down at Basra getting off the boats, there's still equipment getting off the boats, that are never at the front line to make Tigris Corps as large and an effective force as it could have possibly been for some of these operations. So that is a great problem. So just to give you an idea, in January there's 3 attacks, and it results in about 7,500 Anglo-Indian casualties for basically very little result, after which Tanzan comes back and says he's got about 80 days rations left. The result of the failures of Aylmer is that after March, after the attack on Djala Redoubt in early March, he gets replaced by Gorange, and it's said that he wasn't really replaced for any particular strategic or tactical blunder, but rather because his operations had been unfortunate, and they felt just a change at the top would lift the troops. So they bring in Gorange. He was probably one of the most unliked senior officers in the British or Indian Army in the First World War, although Montgomery, who served under him in 47th Division later in the war, thought he was a very, very good divisional commander. He was not liked in Mesopotamia at all. Under Gorange, there's another series of ill-fated attacks at a place called Saniyat in April. 3 assaults there, more heavy casualties, and in the end, on the 22nd of April, the last attack fails, and this time Townsend really does have no supplies, and really it's time up for the Kut garrison. I mean, although you can lay some of the blame for failure of Tigris Corps to get through at the door of Aylmer and Gorange and some of the other senior commanders, or perhaps if the tactics, etc., and put into practice, there were other factors that meant that even the most enterprising commanders in the British Army would have found it very, very difficult to break through to Kut at this time in early 1916. So we're going to look at these. We're going to look at the forces available, transport, change weather, and the Turks as in the opposition. So firstly, who were forming Tigris Corps? Well, initially we've got 3rd and 7th Indian Divisions and the 13th British Division I've already mentioned. Now the 3rd and 7th Divisions have come from France. Remember Indian Corps that rushed in, First Battle of Ypres, and help save the BEF, then fight at Neuve-Chapelle and at Loos in 15, and then a move to India at the end of 1915. Well, they come in. Now, the thing is, on paper, they look really good. They've got lots of combat experience, but we have to remember that they've suffered very heavy casualties in France. So, in fact, a lot of their officers were replacements who had very little experience or language skills with some of the men in their unit. And also, the individual soldiers were coming straight out of the depots with very little training. Captain Davidson of the 87th Japanese remembered in April 1916 in his unit, he said, I've just been teaching my men packing up of trenches, etc. They don't seem to know much about it. And if we get into the enemy trenches, I shall probably have to do most of it myself. So there again, these are recruits that really don't know what they're doing on the battlefield. It's not what you need at this time. You need quick decisions. And a lot of it, if you can devolve it down, and the men know what they're doing, even dig in, it takes a hell of a lot of pressure off the few officers that are around. 13th Division, again, on paper looks good. They've been at Gallipoli, but of course at Gallipoli they've suffered heavy casualties and lots of sickness. And really it's been built up in Egypt. And Captain Richardson, sorry, Captain Harrison, because his name's Ralph, forget Ralph Richardson. Ralph Harrison is an artillery officer, and he says this is the division when it arrives in Mesopotamia. He said, the division was filled with drafts from all over Egypt. It arrived at Sheikh Saad in driblets of different ships, and when it went into action a few days later, few of the men knew their officers by sight, and many COs did not know their officers by name. To use divisions of raw troops in this manner is but to invite disaster. The disaster was not slow in coming. So there we are. It looks, as I say, it looks good on paper, but it isn't. A lot of these guys don't have that much combat experience. And as these troops are arriving in sort of dribs and drabs, as I say, it doesn't give them much men to actually put into the field. For instance, at the first Battle of Hannah on the 21st of January, 7th Division can only field about 4,000 men. The rest of them are either they haven't arrived in theatre, or they're all at Basra, still waiting to actually come up to the front line. Having to use the same troops over and over again. Once they're in the front line and in combat situations, these are the only troops to hand that Aylmer has got in those early days. This means that units are very, very weak. So again, on paper, it looks great. You're putting in, say, a brigade. But for instance, after 2 actions in January, the second Black Watch have only got 300 men they can put into the field, and the 6 Jats have only got 170. So, you know, that's absolutely crazy. I mean, how the hell you're going to take a Turkish well-defended position with such small numbers of men? And of course, every time they go into action again, they're losing more and more experienced men. So it's very, very difficult to, you know, to actually keep going and to actually keep fighting. When Gorange takes over in mid-April, he's got about 24,000 men to hand. But again, most of these men are drafts that have come in. So again, men with not that much combat experience. And the problem is that most of these men are being pushed straight into the line. They've got no time to acclimatise to Mesopotamia. So it means that rather than arrive with a complete draft, a lot of these guys are going sick almost immediately. Second Lieutenant Kingsley of the 1st Seaforth Highlanders recalls, instead of arriving at the front with a draft of 100 men, I actually arrived with only 35. Others, having been landed in small parties, suffering from sandfly fever, dysentery, and similar ailments to which untrained soldiers succumb, such as sunstroke, etc. So this is the idea. So even your drafts coming in, you're not getting a full number of men coming forward. And pretty soon, these low numbers that are left mean that they have to form a number of battalions. And the Black Watch, 2nd Black Watch, 1st Seaforths formed the Highland Battalion in February until sufficient men come forward. And there's also a unit called the Norsets, which are drafts landed for the 2nd Norfolks and 2nd Dorsets, both of whom are in the siege of Kut. So those men have got nowhere to go. So they're put together in a composite battalion to be used by Tigris Corps. So this is the sort of resources we've actually got. The other problem is if men are getting wounded and sick, casualty evacuation at the early point of the campaign is pretty shocking. They're far below the medical establishment they should have at this time. And this again is a point that the Mesopotamia Commission brings out, that we do not have sufficient medical facilities for these men. Captain Kati, the 69th Punjabis, wrote the following in his diary about the medical provisions. He said, "The tales of the wounded Sheikh Saad and the Wadi are really awful, and if one wasn't on the spot, they would be unbelievable. There were no medical officers to dress them properly, and not 20% of the proper number of stretcher bearers. Men were late for 2 to 3 days before being picked up, and we had won the battle. Some poor devils with fractured legs crawled for 4 or 5 miles. The whole expedition apparently started off with only a quarter of their proper medical establishment. Why, no one knows. Perhaps they thought there wouldn't be so many casualties, or that time was so important they couldn't wait any longer for the hospitals. Anyway, the result has been a disgraceful waste of life. Arrangements for taking the wounded to Basra and Amara are just as bad. There are no hospital ships equipped as such. Boats bring troops upriver. Sick and wounded are shoved on board under a medical officer and a few personnel, and it starts back on its downward journey. There are no beds or bedding or cooking arrangements. Men with fractured thighs are shoved alongside dysentery cases. and there they lie until they get to Basra. They're lucky if their wounds are dressed once during the voyage. Many poor devils will die of wounds officially, but really from neglect. So that really sums up the problem for the infantry and the medical facilities. The other problem is they haven't got enough artillery for this operation. We know the First World War, we know the importance of artillery. They don't have anything. They really have no heavy artillery, and until March, they only have 8 60-pounder guns. On top of this, they have a shortage of heavy artillery, of high explosive shells for all types of gun, which means that the Turkish trenches are never really subjected to an adequate destructive bombardment. Here is a photograph of one of the bombardments at Hana. I mean, it hardly looks destructive. And if you were having to get out of your trench and attack that Turkish position on the right, you wouldn't be particularly happy with the amount of shell fire coming down here. Quick couple of war diary entries for the Battle of Hana. This is the 41st Douglas. It says, our artillery fire was very inaccurate, very few shells falling nearer the enemy trenches than 75 yards. During the intensive bombardment, the enemy kept up a very heavy rifle fire, and his morale showed no signs of being affected. So the artillery, in other words, hadn't done its job. The C4th, same battle, it says, intermittent bombardment commenced during morning. Very disappointing, as it was mostly shrapnel, unobserved by aeroplanes, and in our section, no Royal Artillery observer was seen or heard of. Trenches to our front untouched. And of course, the men then know they need to go and assault these trenches. The other problem is that, as you can see, Mesopotamia, this part of Mesopotamia is very, very flat. There's a lack of aircraft, and not much aerial spotting for artillery. So how the hell do you actually get a good view of what you're firing at? Well, you use one of these, a limber pole extension. And this is Captain Harrison about the use of these. He said, we were now faced with the problems of observation of fire in this annoying country. So far, we had relied on the forward observation officer, whose view was normally limited to the backside of the infantryman in front of him, and who, on necessity, was usually prostrate on the flat plain and looking out of a low trench. And from using our ladders from even 20 feet above ground, all the parapets of the trenches ran into one another and gave the appearance of a gigantic ploughed field. We knew that in between the trenches were patches of green grass and crops, but nothing was really visible. It is impossible to make out anything where one trench began and another ended. You did not know whether your rounds were falling on the second line or on a trench some miles to the rear. We did our best to put everything to put up our little limber pole ladder on a mound, but being drawing a lot of unpleasant shell fire, it did little good. So artillery support is really sort of lacking. Of course, it's the First World War. Communications, battlefield communications were really poor. Wireless, the only wireless was between Corps HQ and GHQ Basra. Everything else was field telephones. Unfortunately, India had sent out too few field telephones, and the ones they had sent out were old and quite often breaking down. There was also a shortage of trained signals personnel. So they did try visual signal, sort of flags, markers, etc. And the following comes from the 19th Infantry Brigade War Diary from one of their attacks. And this is about their visual marking of units during their advance. It says, the front line of the leading division during the attack will be marked by red flags and are flanked by screens, khaki on one side and yellow with a black diagonal on the other. In the event of at any time falling so close to our troops at any point become dangerous to them, the nearest flag or screen at that point will at once be waved continuously, the khaki side of the screen being kept towards the enemy. In the event of the 7th Division advance going through 13th Division, the red flags will be taken over by the troops of the 7th Division as they passed through. Now, of course, under heavy fire, this system was very difficult to maintain, and the infantry pretty quickly went out of communication with brigade headquarters. In a critical study of the campaign by the Indian Army Staff College at Quetta in 1923, they said that the system of marker flags was unpopular with many units, as there was a belief that the flags simply marked their position to the enemy, and this led to the abandonment of the flags and the system breaking down almost immediately. So there we are, absolutely no battlefield communications going on here at all. Another problem that they had was a lack of trained staff officers. There were very few available in India, and the staff officers in Tigris Corps at corps level were actually left in France because Nixon said he didn't need them. The staff from the 7th Division didn't arrive in Mesopotamia until after the first battle had been fought. So in that battle, that division, 7th Division, has to basically improvise a divisional headquarters staff. And even Aylmer is cobbling together his corps staff, which includes taking some experienced field officers out of Indian Army units and putting them into staff jobs, when really these men were needed in the front line with their men during the assaults. A great problem. Captain Catty, who we heard from earlier, sums up the whole command and control system of this part of the campaign thus. He said he was one of the officers who was actually taken out of his unit and put in corps headquarters. He said, "I can't help being struck. Everything is bowed down by red tape. I've now seen HQ, Corps HQ, Divisional HQ, Brigade HQ, and it's all the same. Returns and correspondence are first important. You can kill as many men as you like or make as many wasteful tactical blunders, but as long as you send in the right returns, punctually and properly filled in, nothing else seems to matter. There are too many baboos among the officers out here, and they should all be sent up from Basra for a spell in the front line, as it will do the devils a damn lot of good." So that's the immediate problem with the relief force itself. Now, of course, the men and supplies have to get to the front line, so they need transport. And here we have two options. We have the river, and we have basically walking from Basra. We have no railways, no proper roads from Basra to the front line of the campaign. By river, from Basra to Sheikh Saad, if you're on a river steamer, it's 5 days. If you're walking, it's 2 weeks. But they've got a limited number of boats available, so they have to basically supplement it with local craft, such as these sailing craft called mahalas, to actually carry supplies up the Tigris. But they also use river steamers with barges lashed alongside, and in these you carry about 500 men, an artillery battery, or 3 troops of cavalry. They weren't very efficient. Captain MacDonald of the Highland Light Infantry wrote home to his mother about travelling up the river in one of these boats. He said the boat was an old paddle wheel type with no protection against the sun. It had a barge on each side and loaded with stores. Everything was fairly dirty. Onto this oil painting, they tried to cram 600 men and 20 officers. We were at it most of the night. The men were packed in like sardines, literally. The officers had just about room to lie down. Even then, we couldn't get everybody on. And not having enough transport meant that, as I've said before, troops were languishing back at Basra when they should have been in the front line reinforcing Tigris Corps. For example, at the time of the Battle of Sheikh Saad, there were 7 battalions at Basra waiting to come up river. And in March, when the attack on Djala Redoubt went in, there were 12,000 men and 26 guns stuck at Basra. What Aylmer could have done with all those men and 26 pieces of artillery during that attack. Absolutely crazy transport situation. Land transport, as I've said, it's basically walking. no proper roads, no railways, and also horse transport. If you're taking horse transport to the front, the horse transport has to carry its own fodder as well as anything else it's trying to carry. So again, it's totally inefficient. And it really ties Tiber's cord to the river, because the river is the only source of water. We haven't got anything. We can transport enough water into the desert so we can try to outflank the Turkish defences. So the Turks really only have to dig far enough into the desert to sort of know that the British can't get round them in 2 days, because that means that their flanks are secure. We can't carry enough water to get away from the Tigris. It's only in 1970 when motor transport arrives that we can actually cut ourselves loose from the Tigris and actually get on with things, and actually advance and outflank major Turkish positions. The one thing they do have is these two-wheel Indian carts, but again, there's not many of these coming along. These are unsprung carts, and these are also used for casualty evacuation. So people with fractured limbs, etc. Thanks for one of these carts over very, very rough ground for a few miles. You can think of the agony of the guys actually in this. But it's very difficult to keep the men supplied with enough ammunition coming forward with this sort of supply transport they've got in 1916 for the operations. So that's the disadvantages logistically that the Corps have got. If we turn to look at the natural factors, first terrain, well, you can see here that it's so flat. So obviously the advantage is going to be with the defenders. The defenders are in trenches. If you've got to get out of your trench and advance across what is basically a billiard table, you're probably going to suffer heavy casualties. McDonald wrote home to say, I must say here that this country lends itself to defence, and the Turks do all the defending. As I told you, the place is just one. This is in April. The country is just one sea of liquid mud, which is then set hard and has the big river running through it. Thus, it is perfectly, absolutely flat, and you get a sharp, even horizon all the way round. There are no undulations or cover of any sort. So a force sitting in trenches is under cover. The force attacking must come across absolute flat ground, like a muddy cricket field, where they are on full view from the very start. Now, given that these trenches are well made, as they are made by German officers, the odds are enormously on defenders and against the attacker. The Turk won't attack, but we have got to do it as we need to get to Kut. And in nearly every country, you can see some forms of features in the landscape to help your attack, help direct it. Here, there are no features to use, and you have to come across perfectly flat, open plain. The other problem they've got, the only things that do cut across here are old, ancient irrigation channels and canals that are dried out. These are useful as basically bits of dead ground where you can go to ground if you're under heavy fire, but they do stop you if you do break through one of these Turkish lines. You have to make a cut or a bridge over these to move artillery forward, so it will slow down your advance. They also have absolutely no maps at this time. They tried to make some half-inch scale maps and aerial recce sketches, but they are not accurate. Captain Harrison says the only map, TC-18, which was made from a rough plain table sketch by an adjutant in 9th Brigade RFA, was very optimistically reputed to be correct to 1,000 yards. So totally inadequate mapping of any of this as well. Weather and climatic conditions. They've got the problem of mirage. The Turkish trenches are very hard to spot, and quite often it's hard to distinguish between men, trenches, animals, irrigation cuts, or just heat haze. Everything just seems to blend into one. It's very, very difficult to see a target for the artillery to fire on, or for the infantry to actually know they're attacking their actual objective. we're also talking about sort of January through to April. And to start off with, it's very, very wet. There are it's very cold. There are icy winds, heavy rains, hailstorms, etc. And then in sort of March, April time, it's the flood season, and the river floods out and inundates large areas, which actually protects areas of the Turkish defences. So the British are under great problem with actually just trying to advance across it. There are river banks or bunds which stops the Tigris from flooding in some areas. Now the Turks get very, very skillful at blowing open these with artillery and inundating and flooding areas of ground. And a number of British attacks are put in to secure areas to stop the Turks actually controlling the floodwaters of the Tigris, so that they can actually attack major parts of the Turkish line. We need to clear the Turks out of some areas to allow major attacks to go in. So it's very, very, very difficult to actually do any of this. Now, when we actually think of actually having to advance across thick mud, this is mud that's at least ankle deep, if not getting up towards your knees. Very, very difficult if you think to try to advance across that with any speed when you're under machine gun fire. With no cover when you're advancing. You have to make your own head cover with whatever if you come under heavy fire, and then you're basically stuck there under fire until it gets dark, when you can then move or dig in properly. So it's possible once you go to ground to advance any further, and you are literally just stuck on that flat plain under heavy Turkish fire. Here we can see Battalion HQ, and you can see it is literally just a sea of mud alongside the Tigris. Lieutenant General Keary, who commanded 3rd Division, basically said this of the weather conditions in February. He said the temperature has been during recent operations very low, so much so that the men have died of sheer exposure, whilst many wounded did also. We have torrential rain during our advance, and especially in fighting on the 21st of January, where while the cold was intense, the ground more so being a sea of deep mud up to the men's knees, reducing movement of guns and transport, making movement of guns and transport impossible, and the advance of infantry intensely difficult. Added to the climatic conditions, the utter unpreparedness of the force in all essentials of equipment, ammunition supply, and everything you may have some idea, and everything else, you may have some idea of the difficulties the troops have to contend with. So that's really it. I mean, they are missing everything, plus they've got very, very difficult terrain and climatic conditions to actually deal with. On one of your maps, you'll also see that some of the Turkish defences up flanks are secured by the Silkia marsh. At one point, the British actually look at advancing across this marsh. They could advance on a two-divisional front. What then happens is they do a recce, and it seems to be okay. But then in the last minute, one of the brigades actually says, we can't advance. So it's told to stay in its trench. But unfortunately, the other element of the attacking force is still told to go ahead and do the assault. So it basically goes off with half the force to actually do the job. And surprise, surprise, what happens? 1,300 more British and Indian casualties. So it's almost a hopeless situation for the force we've got and the terrain and climatic conditions we're dealing with. Now, on top of that, we have the Turks themselves. Now, the Turkish defences, as I've said, very, very difficult to spot, and they're very, very well built. The Turks have learnt skills at Gallipoli, A lot of the troops that are coming down into Mesopotamia are troops that fought at Gallipoli. German officers have come down in advance and have taught the Turks the new techniques from the Western Front, etc. Typical features of these Turkish fieldworks that we're trying to fight through are trench systems of between 2 and 7 lines of fire trench. The trenches are 6 to 7 foot deep and well loopholed with loophole parapets, well sighted to provide maximum cross and enfilade fire. Wherever possible, the flanks are secured by the Tigris and the Tuakia Marsh. The trenches are defended against potential attempted river crossings. They built trenches down the side of the Tigris, and the British can't actually outflank them by putting a pontoon bridge and attacking from the rear. The positions are very inconspicuous, often invisible at about 200 yards. Not all of the positions are wired in, the Turks preferring concealment to the additional defence proved by barbed wire. They're also backed up by artillery positions, many of which are in double emplacement with 2 gun positions and at right angles to each other, so the Turks can move guns quickly if there is a breakthrough and put flanking fire into the flanking the enfilade fire to any British assault. They also keep reserves centrally in these old dried up canal beds as well. So again, the Turks, very defences. The troops themselves are excellent. These are more and more the sort of troops that we've encountered in Gallipoli, not the local Arab conscripts. These men are battle hardened, they know what they're doing, they're well led, well equipped, got a lot of machine guns, and they sort of know what they're doing. So they're a very, very tough nut to crack. And we know throughout the First World War, all British commanders say the Turk is excellent in the defence. And he proves so here. And this really sets his reputation as a defender. Now, as well as dealing with the Turk, we're also having to deal with the local Arabs. Now, the local Arabs are hostile to both sides. They normally will fight for whoever's winning, so they'll attack whoever's losing, basically. They're they're mounted on small ponies, they're mobile, they're able to move around. They're out for loot, they raid camps, rob wounded, and they rob the dead. They also snipe at camps and infantry columns at long range, and they'll attack any supply columns coming up. So this means that we have to put a lot of men into the defence of the lines of communication. And again, these are men who could have been in the front line. They should be on the strength of Tigris, but they're not. They're defending the lines of communication. So again, it's taking men, dealing with the local Arabs is taking men out of the front line and reducing the fighting ability of Tigris Corps. And really all of those factors go together to combine to really stop Aylmer and Gorange having any real chance of getting through to Townshend. And it really consigns the Kut garrison to its fate. So just in conclusion, I'm going to read you a quick account by Gunner Jack Calloway, who was at Kut when it surrendered at the end of April. He said, "The surrender came and certain formalities were carried out. The flag came down and the Turk took over. Their parties came in. The first we knew was when an officer came over the gun pits flashing his sword about. We were told to fall in and we were then marched away. Before this, we had taken measures to destroy the guns. One we blew to bits with too heavy a charge. All surviving horses were slaughtered. Anything at all possible of use to the Turks, we destroyed. The colonel came along and he said he was sorry for the situation and told us to take care of ourselves and our clothing. We were then divided up and marched out to a point 6 miles away. After 24 hours, the Turks brought round some terrible biscuits. God knows what they were made from, but they were like iron. This was all we seemed to have for days. You had to soak these biscuits in water for hours before you could eat them. You couldn't bite them as they were rock hard. We were then marched in stages of 15 to 20 miles a day. After a few days, I was not fit and managed to get on a boat as I had dysentery. At Baghdad, I was there about 10 days in a palm grove, hanging about with odds and ends of fellows. The battery sergeant major then came along. He'd been in hospital there. and a party of men was put together, and I joined them, and I stuck with him all the way until we got into Turkey. So I'm not going to talk about basically the death march to Turkey. We know about this, but unfortunately the whole cut operation, Tigress Corps, over those 4 months had been fought to a standstill. They lost 23,000 casualties trying to relieve a garrison of 12,000 men. That's 60% of their effective fighting strength. And the surrender at Kut, there was a great fear that it was going to be a Muslim uprising across the Middle East and in India, of course, which doesn't happen. Luckily for the British, they really got away with that there. But the poor handling of the campaign leads to the Mesopotamia Commission, which after 9 months reports back in May 1917, after hearing from 11 witnesses, and gives a damning indictment on decision-making in the campaign, the Indian military admin of the campaign, and the general atmosphere of economy in the Indian government. Blame is apportioned to named individuals. Sir Percy Cox is seen as the chief advocate of the push to Baghdad. Nixon is blamed for lack of experience in such a position as GOC, of totally overestimating the chances of success in reaching Baghdad. CNC India, Sir Richard Duff, is to blame for the inadequate forces available and not remedying the situation when it was obvious, and being totally out of touch with the needs of modern warfare. The Viceroy Lord is equally to blame as Duff for the inadequate forces, also for not overextending objectives of the campaign to achieve the political control of Mesopotamia, and for blindly believing the reports of Cox and Nixon, who reported on the situation in Mespot, and for communicating that in such happy, positive terms to London. Austin Chamberlain, the Secretary of State for India, is also blamed for accepting the advice that comes from India without questioning it. Really, for him, it's a case of ministerial responsibility, and he falls on his sword, which is something that very few ministers seem to be prepared to do in recent governments. So that is really it. The campaign then sort of stagnates, but they bring in a new man, General Maud. They are given a chance to build forces. Maud does everything logistically, gets everything in place, superiority in manpower, superiority in transport, logistics, artillery. He then attacks the Turks December 1916. On the 11th of March 1917, he captures Baghdad. It's an amazing advance, but it was something that was certainly not possible to do in early 1916. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alan. Alan, can you hear my voice?
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, great. Thank you, Alan. Could I ask people to, just by way of applause and thanks, just raise your hands? Okay, the numbers are rocketing up. Okay, thank you very much. You've got 3 digits of hands raised there, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, if you've got any questions, if you'd like to use the Q&A button at the bottom. Before we do that, I'd just like to apologise again that I can't get my own video working. And I know there were 1 or 2 sound problems in the odd sentences in that presentation. Not quite sure what happened there, but the vast majority was audible. Okay, I think given that technology's burnt me badly tonight already, I'm going to read out the questions, if that's all right with you, Alan.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so the first question we've had in came from Philip Norris. And Philip asks, to what extent were the Turkish authorities held accountable for the inhuman treatment of prisoners of war after the surrender of Kut?
Well, they weren't, and at the end of the war, there was once this becomes well known, there is a call for potentially a sort of war crimes trial of a few of these people, but it doesn't come to anything. This Turkish regime has fallen. Various people have disappeared. There's chaos in the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire. And to be honest, there isn't really an appetite for doing this after the war. We've got these mandates in Palestine, in Mesopotamia. We've got problems within the empire. We're looking to the future. We're not looking back to actually prosecute anybody. And the same happens in Germany. There's a couple of people who go to a war crimes trial, but it's left to the Germans to prosecute them, and nothing really happens. It's very much unlike the Second World War, where there is a real concerted effort to put Germans and Japanese people from POW camps basically on trial for ill treatment of prisoners.
Okay, thank you. A very early question that we got in from David Pitcher. So David asks, is there a list of men and their regiments who were inside Kut when it was taken and who died in captivity? And how does the Commonwealth War Graves Commission know the date of death of those in captivity?
That's a good point. I've not seen a full list. One thing I have seen is I think it's at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. There is a notebook kept by a medical officer who accompanied one of the columns that marched across Mesopotamia, and he lists the names of everybody he treated and what happened to them. There are of POWs because, of course, the Red Cross were keeping POW lists. So those Red Cross lists have been digitised and they're available via the Red Cross POW website. All the original records are in Geneva. I believe the CWGC has record. I'm not sure what the records are like. Some of these men are actually buried in Baghdad, Northgate Cemetery. After the war, they were buried in towns in sort of central Turkey where the camps were, and a lot of those cemeteries fell into disrepair, and a lot of them were actually moved. So where the records were available, we know the dates of death, but I don't really know enough about that to give you a full answer on that one, I'm afraid. It's probably piecing that together from various records.
Thank you. The next question came in from Niall Ferguson, and he asks, do you think, as is often said, that Townshend's experience at Chitral in his youth, where waiting to be rescued was successful and made him something of a hero, did this affect his behaviour at Kut?
Yeah, I mean, I think Townshend is definitely feels that he writes in his memoirs that he doesn't want to get into a siege situation, because he said normally a siege situation will end badly for the siege force. But I think once he's there and he thinks, well, at the moment this is in the headlines, as long as things go well, I can come out of this with my reputation enhanced. And I think had he tried to say to one of these breakouts, had that actually failed, yeah, I mean, his reputation, that would have been the end of his war, and probably would have been killed, and that would have been it. As I say, Tanzan was always looking for the next job, if not the job after the next job. He was actually writing to Nixon during the siege to say, oh, well, I hear that there's another division, or there's going to be another corps formed. Of course, I'm the next. I should be basically in line to take this over, because I think he was higher ranked than Gorange. What he was afraid of was if he fails in Kut, Gorange will get the plum job in Mespot, and he'll just vanish from the history books. But he didn't vanish from the history books, but he didn't cover himself in glory, primarily because of what he did later on in captivity, and that really ended his military career.
Okay, thank you. Paul Seabrook makes an observation. He says, it's staggering that Townshend actually thought he could not only capture Baghdad, but more importantly, hold the city against inevitable Turkish counterattacks with a limited force at the end of an overstretched supply line. So his question is, would you agree that logistical incompetence demonstrates just how out of his depth Townshend actually was?
Yeah, I mean, Townshend does initially. He's when he's in Mesopotamia, he goes sick before the advance. He goes sick and he goes back to India and he meets Duff and he says to Duff, "I can't really do this with the division. I need a call." And he says the same thing to Nixon a couple of times. But once Nixon tells him he's not getting a call, and he's going to have to do it with what he's got, he basically goes off and does it. I think because he thinks, well, this is the chance to cover myself in glory. And he's probably thinking like Nixon, the Turks aren't up too much. But yeah, I mean, logistically, and really, he knows. You know, he said it before. You know, he actually said it to people. He knows this is a dodgy enterprise. And at the end, yeah, he runs out of speed. He runs out of manpower because the Turks actually stand and fight. And he hasn't got the logistics. There's no way he's got logistics. I mean, Elmer and Gorange don't have the logistics. They've got more of a force. It's only when Maud comes in and there's no constraints about doing anything quickly, you can build up your logistics. You can get all that in place first. Then you can fight the campaign. Very much. I mean, yeah, had he captured Baghdad, how the hell was he going to hold it? He's going to be 400 miles away from his latest, you know, from any other force. And all the Turks need to do is what they did at Kut, is to surround him. And then he's in the siege in Baghdad, even further away from potential relief, with a larger hostile local population on his doorstep than he was at Kut.
Thank you. Next question is from Geoffrey Fletcher. He says, you've mentioned how under strength many British units were, but what about the Turkish units? Geoffrey, has done a fair bit of work on the Palestine campaign and recognises that the Turks were often massively under strength themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the Turkish forces, when they're there, I mean, initially the Turks are very much down on manpower, but then they're rushing a couple of divisions down after Gallipoli, so they're getting better quality troops coming down. Also, they are basically once they've got Kut bottled up, they're on the defensive. So apart from this massive counterattack that they put in once against Gorange, they're on the defensive for the whole thing. So their casualties are always a lot lighter. Morale-wise, the morale stays up because they see the damage they're inflicting to the British and Indian forces that are actually attacking them. So the morale is relatively high. They've either taken part in Gallipoli or they've heard of Gallipoli as a great victory anyway. They look like they're doing the same to these guys down in Mesopot. So yeah, they are short of manpower. And again, the Turks are at the end of a massively long logistical chain, and the Turkish logistical chain is pretty poor as well. But because they're on the defensive, they've got that advantage. A lot of their trench positions are not held full time, and what they will do is they'll use these dried canal beds, which are sort of 15-20 foot deep, about 8 to 10 foot wide, and they keep reserve forces basically in this dead ground centrally, so they can send men to whichever bit of the line is being attacked. So it's very skillful use by the Turkish field commanders of their sort of relatively limited forces. But I think being on the defensive and being successful on the defensive gives them 1, less casualties and 2, much better morale.
Thank you. The next question is from Simranjit Singh, who asks, are there any landmarks at Kut to remember the Indian soldiers who fought there?
There is the cemetery at Kut-al-Amara Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery, which I think a couple of years ago, I think in 2018, the CWGC went back there and started to reinstigate it because it was badly smashed up during the fighting in Iraq. American troops actually were actually doing some work to just sort of keep it up together. But CGC gone back in, so there will be some Indian graves there. There will be Indian Muslim graves there. I'm not sure if there's memorial to Indian troops of other faiths who actually would have been cremated. But of course, there is at Basra the memorial to the missing, which Saddam Hussein actually moved from its original place, I think near the harbour in Basra. He plonked it in the desert, but it's actually still around. So there are one or two sort of reminders there. There used to be one or two divisional memorials, but I would think they're probably long gone as well. So not a huge amount, but the cemeteries are actually coming back to, I was going to say coming back to life. They are actually being reconstituted.
Thank you. I'll combine a couple of questions here from Dave Bromhall and Martin Bryden, because they're similar questions. So Dave asks, how was the disaster announced to the British public back home? And Martin asks, what was the reaction at home as it developed?
Yeah, I've not really looked into the press too much, but it was reported. But obviously, all the way through the siege, very much a spin of heroic defence is put on this. So Townshend is made out to be a hero. The stand of the men, and I think a lot is made of like Indian and British soldiers together. So a lot of this like imperial unity. But obviously, at the end of the day, you can easily read between the lines. It is a disaster, so it does get reported, and I think this is why they make a lot of the capture of Baghdad in March 17, which totally turns everything around. Because when you think about it, this comes off the back of Gallipoli, and as I said, the big worry is how this is going to play out in India. And in Persia as well, because the British influence in Persia is like a buffer to British India, and we're really worried at this point that the Muslim world is going to go for the Turkish Sultan's jihad and threaten the British position in India. So it is reported. It is seen as a disaster for Britain. Up until the point it falls, it's seen as heroic defenders. So there is definite spin put on that.
Thank you. Got a couple more. Mark Armstrong asks that there are 410 war graves in Kut. Do we know what happened to the bodies of those not buried in the town?
Oh, so anybody who's buried out in the desert? Some of those graves, it depends. I mean, some of these graves would have been lost. The markers would have disappeared. A big problem during the campaign was the Arabs digging up the dead, basically to get hold of clothing, etc. So what they started to do was to bury naked bodies, and once the Arabs got to know that the dead were being buried with nothing on them, they stopped digging them up. So some graves would have been lost, some were concentrated. So I take it would have gone back to Basra, to Kut, or to Baghdad Northgate Cemetery. But yeah, again, I mean, I think probably CWGC would have a better idea on that one than as far as I know. They were buried on the battlefield. Apart from those who died, obviously in the in hospital camps further back. And a lot of the guys were obviously, a lot of them, the badly wounded, were actually evacuated, if they could be, were evacuated back to India as well.
Yep. Okay, and apologies if you covered this in one of the earlier ones, but Brian Wilson says, was Townshend ever held accountable for his systemic failings during the Kut campaign?
No, in fact, the Mespot Commission pretty much says he's not to blame for any of this. Everybody else seems to be to blame. Townshend doesn't actually get blamed for anything. I think Townshend, I don't think until after the war people got really to know how badly this had gone. And it's really Townshend's, what Townshend does after this, which really damns him in the light of the British and Indian Army hierarchies. It's really, and where he basically goes off to live in a palace in Constantinople and basically does nothing really to find out about what the hell's happened to any of his men. Because when at the end of the war, Townshend thinks that he's wondering why he's not given another command. He said, "Oh no, I did perfectly well, and I was also the officer on charge who took the surrender of the Turks at Mudros as well. Why wasn't I given a command?" And he actually ends up as a Tory MP for a couple of years. Then probably, luckily for him, he dies in I think about 1924. So he never got to grow into a very old, bitter man. He writes his memoir in 1920, trying to exonerate himself through the use of military history. Becomes a Tory MP and dies not long after that. Okay,
we've just had 4 short questions come in while you've been answering that one, so I'll just rattle through them quickly. So Mo Duar asks, could we have got through the war without the oil that was being defended?
I think it would have been quite difficult. We were getting oil supplies from America and other places, but I think we wanted a secure British oil supply. And obviously the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, it was a sort of very much a British sort of concern. So it was a good supply, ready supply of oil. So yes, we did need it, but we could have secured it. Well, we did secure it by April 15. All this mucking around for the rest of the war, none of that needed to happen. That was the whole problem.
Okay, there's a couple of questions coming about the maps that you distributed before the talk. So the first question is, on the defences of Kut map, sorry, this is Malcolm Sperring Toy, on the defences of Kut map, immediately in front of the Turkish trenches, or many what look like small letter X's. What's the reason for those? What are they?
That is barbed wire.
Barbed wire. Right,
that's a normal trench map symbol for barbed wire entanglement.
Okay, and there's another one about a map, which was the first map. It is taken from a book called Forgotten Fronts. Peter Newnham would like to know the author of the book.
Oh, that one, yeah, that Forgotten. That's the colour map, the map of Mespot, I think. That book is actually a British Army Ministry of Defence book, which was put out as a guide, a training guide for sort of officers and NCOs. During the centenary, there's one volume on the Western Front and one on Forgotten Fronts, and each chapter of the Forgotten Fronts book is written by a different person. I actually wrote the chapter on Salonika, not Mesopotamia in that book.
Thank you. And the final question comes from James Hayday, who says, why was Townshend looked after by the Turks, but the lower ranks were ill-treated?
Mainly because Townshend was ill. It's as simple as that. The Turks took all of the officers, and unless an officer demanded to walk with the men, all officers were put on boats and taken to Baghdad, and then had a much easier time getting out of Mesopotamia. All senior officers. I mean, the only senior officer that went with the men, I think, was General Mellis, and that's because he was ill. He was sick in Baghdad, and by the time he came out of hospital, he decided, with a little entourage, to actually follow the men marching north, and he actually saved a lot of the guys. He actually came across starving British and Indian soldiers and used the force of his personality and some of the money he had to basically bribe or cajole Turks to actually rescue these guys. Whereas the Turks, the Turks saw, I think they saw having Townshend as a captive gave them kudos. Having this senior British officer in Constantinople. I mean, he went to dinner with senior people in the Turkish government. So it was very much that he was a commander, so they treated him well.
Excellent. Thank you. And Alan, thank you very much indeed for such an informative talk. Very much enjoyed it. As I say, sorry my video's not working. So that's it, folks. As usual, there'll be more webinars each Thursday and Monday. The details on the Western Front Association website. The one coming up this Thursday is by Dr. Chris Campsall, and it's about the British, French and American soldiers on the Western Front in 1918, their relations and how they collaborated together. So just once more to thank Alan. Sorry for the technical problems, and that's it. Alan, I'll drop you an email in the morning.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Officers get